Dr. Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. What a gift it is to welcome you to this video presentation that begins our discussion of the third dwelling places in the interior castle of the soul as described by St. Teresa of Avila. St. Teresa begins this chapter 1 of 2 talking about the third dwelling places with reference to Psalm 112 verse 1. Blessed is the man or woman who fears the Lord. She begins with the gift of the Holy Spirit, fear of the Lord, to talk about entering into the third dwelling places and remaining there. One arrives in the third dwelling places through fear of the Lord, and so thereby embarks on the secure path to his or her salvation. El camino seguro de su salvación. The secure path of one's salvation is really beginning in the third dwelling places. In the first two dwelling places of the soul, there's too much duplicity, too much capitulation to the things of the world, the kingdom of darkness, and there's a lot of uncertainty on this road of salvation, the first and second dwelling places, because one keeps getting bumped out of the interior castle, found on the outside of the wall, and hopefully not in mortal sin, which is death, which is eternal death. But she's pushing her listeners to the innermost chambers of the soul where the Most Holy Trinity resides. The third dwelling places are entered because of winning many spiritual battles in the first and second dwelling places. Even according to her own autobiographical testimony, St. Teresa lived among the third dwelling places for 10 years of her life before proceeding to the fourth through seventh dwelling places. That's quite amazing when we think about such a great saint, doctor of the church, the one who founded the Reformed order of the Discalced Carmelites, that for 10 years of her life, she looks back and said, I was pretty much living in the third dwelling places. 10 years. So, wow, for us trying to understand what she's talking about, we wonder where we've been the past 10 years of our lives. What kind of dwelling places have we been in? When we hear about the first and second dwelling places and now the third, where have we been? How long are we going to remain where we've been? Or are we pushing ahead by the grace of God toward the seventh dwelling places in the perfect union with God? So we want to talk more about the third dwelling places. What happens here? She says that one receives security of conscience, seguridad de conciencia. One receives security of conscience here if he or she does not abandon the path he began on. So whereas in the first and second dwelling places, there can be a lot of insecurity with what's going on and where am I at my relationship with God? Am I all in or not? In the third dwelling places, it's like here someone finds him or herself all in and moving forward and not backward. Very intentional, security of conscience, like we think of what St. Paul says, where he wants to have a clear conscience before the people he's witnessing to. But one has to commit not to abandon the path he began on. As Jesus says, no one who sets his or her hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of heaven. We have to set our hand to the plow, entering this interior castle, and not take our hand off it and not look back, not look to the right or the left, but focus on where Christ is and where he is, there we want to be. In paragraph 2 of chapter 1 of the third dwelling places, St. Teresa writes that it is a great misery to live a life in which we must always walk like those whose enemies are at their doorstep. They can neither sleep nor eat without weapons, and without being always frightened, lest somewhere these enemies might be able to break through this fortress. Wow. So she's talking about, especially in the first and second dwelling places, we are living like the enemy is always nearby, always at the doorstep. We always need these weapons here to guard ourselves against demonic influence, demonic interference, demonic oppression, and it's true. As she's saying, in the third dwelling places, as we enter them, we still have to be on guard, but there's something that comes with that security of conscience, where we're not so paranoid as we are in the first and second dwelling places. We can rest in the security of God's grace and where He's taken us now, and not fear this constant nearby attack. We are more secure in the third dwelling places. And it's a great misery to have to live like always paranoid about the enemy. She's not saying we can totally forget about the enemy, but there's a more restfulness within the third dwelling places where it's not like this spiritual paranoia. But it comes at a high price. We have to die with Christ. And as we move through the first and second dwelling places, that's what's been happening. We are put to death daily with Christ. As St. Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. And that he wants to be crucified with Christ. He wants to know nothing else except Jesus Christ and him crucified. This is what's required to enter and to remain in the third dwelling places. As she writes, if it is your will, my God, may we die with you. For living without you, and with these fears of the possibility of losing you forever, is nothing else than dying often. Morir muchas veces. Dying many times. So, to live with God, to live with Him in the third dwelling places, we have to die with Him. And to die often with Him. It's a great paradox that the degree to which we die, we live. And Jesus says as much in the Gospels. The one who attempts to save his or her life will lose it. But if you intentionally, willfully, wholeheartedly lose your life for my sake and the sake of the gospel, you will save it. It will be saved. In the third dwelling places, we find a person whose whole happiness is to please God. Quien todo su contento es contentar a Dios. The one whose whole happiness, todo su contento, es contentar a Dios, is to please God, is to make God happy. God is eternal happiness, but to think of it in this way, that my happiness is by making God happy. Closely related to this, my happiness is being responsible for the other person who faces me and ensuring that they are happy, that they are well. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, love is willing the good of the other. The degree to which I will the good of the other, I will that the Father's will is done, I will to please God, is my happiness. That's my happiness in the third dwelling places. This is my whole happiness, to please God. I don't want anything else. I don't desire anything else but to please God, to satisfy His will, to conform to His plans. That's my whole happiness, no matter what those plans are. I want to know, God, what are your plans and how can I live them? That is my whole happiness. Even if I live without honor, without health, without financial security, without fame, fortune, glory, all the things of this world, Even if I live without all of these, as long as I live to please God, I am perfectly happy. No matter what happens, no matter what comes, I am perfectly happy. Nothing can shake this. This is a beautiful truth. Again, when we read St. Thomas Aquinas in his treatise on happiness in his Summa Theologiae, he says similar kinds of things that were written roughly 300 years before St. Teresa of Avila is writing this. But a lot of the saints say similar things, but St. Thomas Aquinas says it makes sense that our happiness, what the cause of our happiness, is not contingent on anything besides God. That makes perfect sense, because anything that is not God changes. And if we're going to have permanent and lasting happiness, it can't be based on something that is passing. God is the only thing, one kind of being, not a being but being itself, that is not subject to change, decay. And because of God, we too can have eternal life with Him. So this is a huge, powerful line here. You can ask yourself, what is your whole happiness? Is it contingent on anything else besides God? Even reasonably very valuable things in this life. Even relationships in this life. Is it contingent on these? St. Teresa says, in the third dwelling places we find people whose whole happiness, their whole happiness, todo su contento, es contentar a Dios, is to please God. It pleases me to please God. She goes on to say that the souls who have passed into the third dwelling places long not to offend His Majesty, God, even guarding themselves against venial sins. They are fond of doing penance and setting aside periods for recollection, sus horas de recogimiento, hours, times of recollection. So they like to do penance. They don't want to sin at all, even in small ways, in thought, word, or deed. And they set aside times for recollection. That is the beginning of contemplative prayer. It implies times of vocal prayer, prayer of meditation, things like the Rosary, Lectio Divina, the reading of Scripture and spiritual classics like this one, but also moving into a contemplative prayer, where the privileged language is silence, and it requires solitude and quieting of all the senses. The third dwelling places are moving into the prayer of contemplation proper, whereas the first and second dwelling places are really training grounds for spiritual perfection and moving toward these more passive states of contemplative prayer. People in the third dwelling places, she says, spend their time well, practicing works of charity toward their neighbors. And they are very balanced in their use of speech and dress, and in the governing of their households, those who have them. So she's speaking not only to the nuns here, she's talking about lay people too, married people too here. How would you describe married people, lay people, single people who are moving into the third dwelling places and living there? They're balanced in their use of speech and how they dress, how they clothe themselves, how they carry themselves, and how they govern their households as parents. Do they govern their households well? Do they pour out their lives, their energy, for the sake of raising their children in the faith and toward all the good things God has created and to knowing and loving God? Finally, she says those who desire to enter the third dwelling places and do enter there, desire to enter the final dwelling place, la postrera morada, the last dwelling place, the seventh dwelling place is perfect union with God. So this is it's really a conversion of desire away from the things of the world and completely toward the things of God. In paragraph 6 of chapter 1 of the Third Dwelling Places, St. Teresa goes on to say, Enter, my daughters, into the interior rooms, en lo interior. Pass on from your little works, vuestras obrías. By the mere fact that you are Christians, you must do all these things and much more. It is enough for you to be God's vassals. Don't let your desire be for so much that as a result you will be left with nothing. What is she really getting at here? That desire is concentrated, desire of the heart is concentrated completely on the things of God, and the most interior rooms of the castle, yearning to get there. It's like when we go on a trip and we're trying to reach our final destination, we have so much yearning to get there. You're on the plane, you're in the car, looking at the hours, only 1 hour left, half hour left. Oh, I can't wait to arrive. You're saying, have this ultimate desire toward the 7 dwelling places of your interior castle of your soul. What she's also talking about here is in the spiritual life, a lot of times we can get hung up on wanting to feel something, wanting to be moved by the spiritual delights of God and the consolations of God. So when she's talking about the 3rd dwelling places, it's really where she's making a careful distinction between, in Spanish, what she calls gustos, spiritual delights, and contentos, spiritual consolations. Delights and consolations. We'll unpack these terms more as we go, along with commenting on the interior castle. But for now, it's good she's making a distinction, but they're still in the same general category of, how do we describe this in terms of, I feel something in the spiritual life. I feel lifted. I feel a kind of ecstatic movement in relation to God. I feel totally set at peace. Nothing is bothering me. Nothing is disturbing me. It's like an injection of a spiritual stimulus in the soul, not to be viewed as some kind of drug or something like this. That's the danger in the spiritual life. St. John of the Cross talks about this as well. Once we overcome the vices of the flesh, things like pride, lust, gluttony, envy, anger, laziness, all these kinds of things, we are met with vices of the spirit. Spiritual pride, spiritual anger, spiritual gluttony, spiritual lust. We're met with these kind of things. And these have to be overcome too by renouncing the idolatry of spiritual gifts. So again, it's a paradox here. If you long to live like the saints, you have to renounce all that is less than God, all that is not God, even spiritual goods. We can't gather these up like Pac-Man, just gobbling up one spiritual good at a time. We can't be like, more gustos, more contentos, pour them out on me, pour them out within me, God, as if that's the point. It's not the point. Some people talk about in their spiritual lives of having a God high, and they want to go on another retreat so they can get that God high again. I worked in youth ministry for 10 years, and this was a common phenomenon I experienced with teenagers. They loved going on that weekend retreat, and they call it getting a God high. And I was always trying to work with them that faith cannot be contingent on these God highs. We have to be resolved to go through these dry times in the spiritual life, these deserts, and to live there and to know that that's important. We can't just jump like a frog, lily pad to lily pad, God high to God high to God high. There's retreats are good, and all these powerful experiences are good when there's lots of people and music and the big conference and things. It's encouraging, but faith cannot depend on all of these externals. This is what St. Teresa is getting at. So in the 3rd dwelling places, she's saying you have to grow in detachment from all these spiritual goods. in order to move further within the castle. Your faith can't depend on all these things. Sometimes God gives them, sometimes God withholds them. And what she's saying is, before you might experience these much, God is withholding them to test you, to test your faith, to see does it depend on Him completely or anything else. In paragraph 7 of chapter 1 of the Third Dwelling Places, St. Teresa says, anyone who makes such an issue, makes a big deal about this dryness, estas sequedades, this dryness in the spiritual life, is a little lacking in humility. Always coming back to humility. You'll notice if you're reading the Third Dwelling Places how often she says the word humility. It's like the queen virtue for the Carmelites, humility, right next to love. So anyone who makes such an issue, makes a big deal, complains a lot about the spiritual dryness, is a little lacking in humility. The humble person understands it's part of the project, the process of the spiritual life. You can't climb the mountain unless at the same time treading through the desert. It's a lot of self-denial and no crutches to lean on. Nothing else but this purity of faith in God. St. John of the Cross again talks a lot about the theological virtues of faith and hope and love in relation to the emptying of the intellect, also called the understanding or reason, in relation to faith, the emptying of the memory in relation to hope, the emptying of the will in relation to love. But here we see St. Teresa says to remain, to move within and beyond the third dwelling places, one has to be growing by the grace of God in such humility and not complain and whine about all the spiritual dryness that will be part of this journey. It's necessary, it's there, it's a prerequisite, condition of possibility for going into the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh dwelling places. You have to realize that in the spiritual life. You have to stick with it. A lot of what's called asceticism, spiritual exercise, ascesis, a lot of austerity, a lot of mortification, self-denial, detachment. All of this, the Carmelites talk about over and over again. When you're not feeling anything, a ripe time for faith to do its best work. She goes on to say, for His Majesty, the Lord, must give the reward in conformity with the love we have for Him. And this love, este amor, daughters, must not be fabricated in our imaginations, but proved by deeds. Probado por obras, proved by our works, proved by how we live. And don't think He needs our works. He needs the determination of our wills, she says. La determinación de nuestra voluntad. The determination of our will. She uses this word so much too in The Way of Perfection. Have this determined determination. Determinada determinación. Determined determination. This is what God wants from us most of all. That we're resolute in Him, in pleasing Him. Not that He needs all our works, all this demonstration. He needs the non-duplicity, the singularity of our wills. I'm for you, God, I'm all for you. This is why I'm not interested in sinning. This is why I'm not interested in all the things of the world. This is why my relationship with you, God, is not contingent on anything else but you. Beautiful. In paragraph 8 of this chapter, St. Teresa says, there is no doubt that if a person perseveres in this nakedness and detachment from all worldly things, she will reach her goal. Si persevera en esta desnudez y dejamiento de todo. This nakedness and detachment from all worldly things. If someone perseveres in this, she will reach her goal. Detachment, nakedness. Nakedness, detachment from all worldly things. Everything. Dejamiento de todo. Detached from everything that's not God. But this perseverance includes the condition that you consider yourselves useless servants. Siervo sin provecho. Servants without honor, without rank, without deserving reward. This is the attitude one has to have about oneself. Again, that growth through humility and self-knowledge. As Jesus says, after all that happens with following me, you would say, I have done what I was supposed to do. I'm a useless servant. It's the truth about me. I've been a sinner. The least I can do in relation to all God has done to me is to be faithful, is to be obedient, is to give up everything for Him. And I've simply done my duty. I've not done anything extraordinary, because after all, what I've done isn't from me, it's from Him. It's His grace at work within me. All the credit goes back to God. I'm a sail in a mast, in a boom. And it's the wind of God that moves the vessel. In paragraph 9, St. Teresa says, the fact is that God did nothing else but serve us all the time He lived in this world. In the incarnate Word in Jesus of Nazareth. How did Jesus live? He came not to be served, but to serve, He says. And He showed that in how He lived and what He had to say, how He gave up His life. That's the fact about God in the flesh. He did nothing else but serve us all the time He lived in this world, and yet we ask Him again for favors and gifts, material ones and spiritual ones. Mercedes, de nuevo, y regalos. We keep asking Him for more. What more do we need to ask God for when He's given everything He has to give already? Himself. In word and sacrament. What else am I looking for in this life? And Him, all of Him, right there. Present on the altar, present in the monstrance, in the tabernacle, in my hand, on my tongue. What else do I need than Him? This is what the saints reveal. They live a life that they've just let go of everything except the Lord. They live at the hand of the Lord completely. Like another Carmelite, St. Edith Stein, also called Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, says we have to learn to live at the hand of the Lord in everything. St. Teresa says, further out of dryness, you may draw humility and not disquiet, which is what the devil aims after. The devil aims after disquiet, disturbance, restlessness. And this is what we get with all the things of the world, is it not? The more we're involved in them, the more we're beholden to them, the more restless we are, the more we lose sleep, the more we're distracted, disturbed, distressed. But she says, St. Teresa says, in the spiritual dryness, when there is nothing flashy, when nobody's paying attention, when we're not doing what we're doing in the spiritual life for any other reason besides entering into communion with God, hidden communion with God, you will draw humility from all this, from this way of prayer, from this lifestyle of total dependence on God. And it's very hidden. There's not going to be anybody watching. The last quote I want to share with you from paragraph 9 of chapter 1 of the Third Dwelling Places is this. St. Teresa says, be convinced that where humility is truly present, God will give a peace and conformity. una paz y conformidad. She doesn't say peace and contentos, gustos, conformidad. Conformity to Him. Imitation of the life of Christ. To love like He loves. To be with the form that is the form of God. This is what we want. We don't want anything on the side of God. We want God. Exclusively God. Because God is all. God is everything. This is the great mystery of being a creature. St. Augustine puts it so eloquently, the very first paragraph of his Confessions. You have created us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. We don't want to live with this cor inquietud, this disquieted heart. We want to rest in God and have the peace of knowing the Lord, of loving Him and letting ourselves be known by Him and loved by Him. And this is where humility is truly present. Where humility is truly present, God gives peace and conformity to the divine image in the soul. That's what we're after in this interior castle. We're not meant to gather up all of the gustos and contentos like Easter eggs with all of these sweets in them. If that's the point, we miss the point of Easter, resurrection itself. So we don't want to confuse the sign for the reality. The signs assist in pointing to the reality, confirming the reality, but the reality, in Latin the res, is God. God alone. God's divine life, being, everything God is. We want to be conformed to this, and therein is peace. Humility is a condition of possibility for receiving this peace and conformity God has to give to us. And the fortitude, las fortalezas, of those who walk in dryness. Where humility is present, there also is the fortitude of those who walk in dryness in the spiritual life. Humility and fortitude work together. That's a beautiful pairing there. Humility and fortitude. I am courageous to the degree that I am humble by God's grace. We might think, according to the world, where there's more humility, there's more weakness. According to the way of the world, yes, that's true. And that's the difficulty in following Christ. It's like, I can't sell out to the world. I can't be like everyone in the world. I can't be living for what other people clearly are living for. That's not God. With humility comes fortitude for those who walk in dryness and understand that's a part of the deal in following Christ. Just like He went out into the desert and was tested, so must we follow His same footsteps. First dwelling places, second dwelling places, into the third dwelling places. This is what's going on. Thank you so much for reflecting along with me on this first chapter of the third dwelling places, and look forward to journeying with you further into the interior castle of the soul.